Hi, it's time for another chime video. Today we're going to be working on a model K44 chime base. I know that I've made a previous K44 chime base servicing and repair video, but this is a different version of the K44 chime base. The first video that I made was a K44 chime base from 1947, which would have been one of the very earliest ones. And this particular base here, this is a mid or later 50s K44 majestic chime base, and they are somewhat different in the details of how they're constructed and the different parts in it. So this will be somewhat different than the other one. Some parts are the same, but the important bits are different. What you see here spread out on the workbench is a vast array of all of the kinds of things that I'm going to need to repair and rebuild this K44 chime base. I chose this one in particular because this was sent in by a customer. This one is in particularly bad shape, and this is more typical of what we get in for repair than some of the other ones I've had lately, and I wanted to show you that even one that's in as rough a shape as this one seems to be is still a repairable chime base. Quick review of what's on the workbench. This is everything I could think of to put out before I start. I'm sure there's something I forgot, and we'll add that in as we go along. So if we sort of go across the workbench, let's look at what we've got. We're going to have a variety of screwdrivers. Both, I have a Phillips, which I don't think I actually will need on this. So I'm going to put that away. So I've got a large and a small flat screwdriver, my pair of needle nose pliers that I use for just about everything. We've got some isopropyl alcohol in a spray can. We have our little aluminum tin cups for parts storage. I've got some solder and desoldering braid that we're going to use. I've got a toothbrush, which is for cleaning, some pencils, a bunch of rags. I've got some latex gloves because there's some parts of this that are messy and I don't want to get my hands all dirty right now. I've got a variety of grommets. I've got my different grits of wet dry sandpaper. I've got some super glue. I've got some 3-in-1 oil. I've got my Ronson lighter fluid. I've got my Simichrome polishing compound. Over here I've got a digital caliper for measuring. Oh, one of the most important parts is I have a really small Allen wrench. This is a 1.25 millimeter Allen wrench, and you're going to need one of these if you're going to work on a chime just like this one. We have that. I actually have a couple of those because it's so skinny and small that it's easy to lose. So I have that. I think that's everything that I need. So let's go ahead, or at least it's everything I need that I can think of right now. So let me clear some of this away and we'll talk about this chime base and what the customer sent to me, and let's see if we can get it fixed. Okay, so I've got everything sort of pushed off to the side. I put things back to where I normally keep them so I don't have to think about where they are. I can just reach and they're within reach, which is what I like. So this is a late model K44 chime base, and this is in the same exact condition that I received it in from the customer. And that includes these parts over here, which have already been removed from the chime base, and they were in a plastic bag in the box. We have our little aluminum cups, which we need for parts storage, so let's go ahead and get those sorted and put off to the side so we don't lose anything. We have the 4 plunger assemblies here. They all have red tips. We'll be dealing with each and every part as we go along. These look like they're all in reasonably good condition, which I like. So those go in a cup and they go off on the side. We have 5 of the brass solenoid caps. These were also loose. This one is from the back, one of the back of the solenoid tubes, because it has a piece of foam in it. This chime has been worked on before. Worked on would be in serious quotes because it's not in very good shape right now. So we have one of those, and then we have the caps for the front of the tubes. These caps are in really bad shape. I think there's one of them in particular. See if I can find it. It's not this one, I don't think. These all have, I think they do. They all have splits in the caps. Maybe this one is the worst one. I don't know how well you can see this. If it focuses, you might be able to. It's kind of hard to make it focus on something that small. There, that might be pretty good. It's not round at all. It's got two splits across from each other in it, and it's kind of out of shape, and we're going to have to do something about that. So those go in there in another cup. And here, which is hard to see, are the springs. I know springs are always hard to see. Maybe this way. Springs. There's one in the cup. This one, you might be able to see, it's kind of bent out of shape and it's kind of stretched out in the center, so it would be what I would call kind of mangled. And here's the third one. It's kind of bent, kind of stretched, not great. And the fourth one, it's missing in action, so we're going to have to deal with a missing spring. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the cup with the springs, and I'm going to take the cup with the caps. I'm going to put the cup on top like this to keep the springs safe inside. In fact, to get these out of the way for the time being, I'm going to stack them all together like this. So we have sealed part storage now. Not a bad way to go. We've got an extra cup there, and I've got more over here. I think we're going to need at least 3 more. So we'll put those there. So that gives us a total of 7 to start with. So let's take a look at this. Let's look at the differences in this first, and then we'll talk about what's wrong with this one in particular. Alright, so the primary difference, and what I'm going to do is, I'm going to talk about this, and as I talk about the differences between this one and the earliest 1947 chime base, I'm going to splice in little portions of the 1947 video and go back and forth so you can kind of see the differences that I'm talking about. On the front of the unit here, on the front of the chassis, some of the easy to spot differences are, first of all, here on the loudness control, this has the later style sliding rheostat with the little arrow indicator here that you go from soft to loud, and then it has an off position up here at the top. The earlier K model chime bases, and all of this refers back to the 1947 chime base in the other video, so you can watch that too, which I would recommend. They had a rotary knob connected to a rheostat on the back, and you would turn the knob to adjust the volume. So this is a big difference. The other thing that is different, on the earlier chime, all of these chimes are 8 or 4 note chimes, and on the 1947 chime base, there's a toggle switch right here that goes through this hole, and it says 8 and 4. And in these later chime bases, that's gone. If I hold this, you can see there's this lever right here that's behind the coil of the motor, and if you look carefully here underneath, it says 4, and if I move the lever out of the way, you can see underneath this end it says 8. So this is your 8 and 4 note adjustment for how many notes the chime rings, and I'll show you when we turn it around what this lever is connected to on the back of the unit. The Telecom motor assembly used in this mid or late 50s NuTone K model chime base is the exact same model as used in the 1947 chime. It's a type B3. It's a 20 volt motor. It runs at 4 RPMs and uses 4 watts of power. At this point, it was still the Warren Telecom company in Ashland, Massachusetts. This is before it was purchased by General Electric and it became General Electric Telecom. So before we get to the back of the chime, we'll have to disassemble part of the chime to show you some of the other important differences. But while we're looking at the front of the unit, let's talk about the things that are wrong with this one in particular, because this one looks like it's had a fairly hard life. So the things that are wrong with it immediately are, well, everything is immediate, I guess, because it has a lot of things wrong with it. The rubber grommets that hold the motor assembly plate to the chassis are all gone. So the motor's flopping around in there loose. Someone has taken this apart sometime in the past because the screws with the nuts and washers are in backwards. The nuts are supposed to be on the back side and the screw heads are here on the front. So all of that is no good. I did measure the resistance of the motor coil and it seems to be alright. So that's probably okay. The grommets, like on all of these, the grommets that isolate the solenoid assemblies from the chassis, they've all turned into little chunky bits of tar, so those all have to be replaced. This unit's probably been dropped at some time, and this little switch right here, this is an on-off rotary switch that controls the light that goes in the socket here. On a K44 Majestic, it's sort of an accent light that shines up on the wall through the top of the cover of the chime, and this controls the light. This is broken. The body of the switch here is broken off completely, or is broken, like somebody dropped it. So this is not going to be repairable, so I'm going to have to see if I have a replacement that's like this that I can put in place of this one. The other reason I think it's been dropped is this corner was really bent. I've actually straightened it out some already, because as I was sort of inspecting this before I started the video, it just kind of bugged me that it was bent, so I sort of straightened it out the best I could. This little post right here is kind of loose, especially compared to that one. These are the posts that the back of the covers attach onto. They fit into little detents inside the plastic cover. This shouldn't be a fatal problem, and I might be able to put a little JB weld or something to sort of smear it in there, and it'll harden up in the gap and hold it in place. It's not a high stress thing, but it's important that it be there. That's a problem. Someone has worked on this before because they put foam in the back of the solenoids to replace the cushions, and that's all got to come out. It's just kind of in rough shape. I also noticed that this corner here is folded over for some reason. Maybe it started off from dropping, or I don't know how that would have happened. I'm going to have to try to straighten that out. A couple of the ears on the tube hanging brackets are kind of bent. I'll have to straighten those out. To show you what's rest of it, let's flip it over and take the back apart, and I'll show you some of the differences, and then let's see if we can get this working again. It's going to be a job. So to begin disassembling this, the first thing we have to do is we have to remove the screws and nuts in the corner of the motor brackets, because it releases this cover plate on the back. Normally what you would do is the nuts would be on the back side, and you would take the nuts off and the plate comes away. In this case, I've got to take it apart. It's all put together backwards, so I've got to take the nuts off from the front. And I think what I'm going to do, fortunately, I know it's hard to see, is since there's no grommets, all I'm sort of doing is holding the, that might work or it might not. Let's see if we can do it this way. I'm just holding the nut with the needle nose pliers and turning the screw to take it off. So there's one nut. These have really small nuts. They're little brass nuts, and I believe that they are 3/16 nuts, and they're fine thread. I'm not sure what the thread pitch is. It's probably 24 or 32, but like always, we're going to put it in the cup so we don't lose it, because we need all of these. So let's see if we can get the top one out. Whoever worked on this really managed to mangle it up, and I've been waiting to make a video about this particular version of a K model chime base, and I've had several in recently, but they were all in fairly good shape, and it wouldn't have made as good of a video. Another one. Alright, now this last one, the other thing which I'm going to see, maybe we'll leave that. This last one, the screw is in the right way, even though there's no nut on it. So I'm just unthreading the screw right now, and we'll take that out in the cup. And then we've got, this one just sort of fell out. This is the brass ferrule that goes through the top, that sits in the top of the grommet. So we'll talk more about that in a while. I just don't want to lose any parts to this. So if I can, there's another one in the cup. Here's another one in the cup, and let's see if we get the top one out, because again, we don't want to lose anything because we need everything. And this one's got a spacer also. We'll talk more about those. That goes in there. Alright, that's pretty good. So now that we've got the screws out, we can sort of take the cover off the back. It might be that we have to unthread the screw, 3 screws. Now you have to remember, these are in backwards, so it'll be different when we reassemble this. I know it's always really exciting watching me stand here and unscrew things, but this is sort of a real step-by-step, and you have to sit through all the agonizing details. Let's talk about one thing before I take all this off altogether. All of these chimes, all the K model chimes, they have this little terminal barrier strip right here, and it's always held in place on the bottom right hand screw, and it has a single wire that comes off of it. Let's take this off. It has a single wire that goes back and disappears under the cover, and I've had a lot of people ask me, what is that for? Well, it has nothing to do with making this chime base operate. What it's actually for is to make another chime base operate. So the idea originally was, if you had a really large house, I suppose, you might have 2 chimes like this. Or maybe you would have a simpler chime in the back end of the house. This would be in the maybe formal entryway or something like that, in the formal part of the house, and then in the more living space of the house, you have to remember this is in the old days, you might have a simpler chime, and this would be what was later called the external front connection. This would be wired to supply power to another chime in another part of the house, so when this chime is activated, it sends power to this momentarily to ring another chime or activate another long tube chime. I don't know how often this was ever used, but that's what it's for, and that's where it lives, bottom right hand screw. So let's pick up all these little spacers for a second and take this screw out, and this screw, and this spacer, and the cover, and the screw, and the cover. So here's a lot more parts. Where do they go? They go in the cup. Can't lose it. So here's our cover that was over the back of the contact assembly, and it's just a metal cover. It does have riveted to it this sort of cardboard insulator material to keep it so it doesn't short out anything, and you don't need to do anything with this other than maybe just clean off the dirt and stuff. So we're just going to put that aside. It doesn't go in a cup, it's too big. So let's look at the back of the contact assembly, and this is where one of the fundamental differences between a late model chime and the early 1947 chime is. As you will be able to see when I splice in the portion of the original 1947 video, this portion on the back of the motor assembly, this is the contact or sequencing switch assembly. As you'll be able to see in the pictures from the 1947 chime video, the original K model chimes in this area had a fairly complex fixed contact point ring assembly with a rotating center portion. The rotating center portion was connected to the motor shaft, and it would turn the disc in the center that had a complex contact assembly made around the outer edge, and it would touch different contact points and make the chime ring in the right sequence. All of those little contact points are all hand soldered, just like these are, to different portions of the chime, but I have a feeling that it was probably too labor intensive, or perhaps it was too fragile of a part, or it was too expensive of a part. And in the later model K chime bases, you have an entirely different assembly, which is this. So on these later model K chime bases, let's take this wire out of the way. What we have here is this sort of rectangular shaped circuit board material. It might be fiberglass or it might be some kind of phenolic resin, and it has these contact points here. They are little riveted points with these metal tabs where the wires are wound around the ends, and then they're soldered in place. And so what we have here is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, 6, 7, 8, which correspond with the first 4 notes of the Westminster chime and then the second 4 notes of the Westminster chime. And if you recall, when we were looking at the front of the chime assembly, we had our moving lever switch for 4 notes or 8 notes, and that lever switch is attached to this top portion of the board. And right now it's in the 8 note position, and if I slide it over to the 4 note position, you'll see the switch opens up. So this part of the top part of the circuit board is movable, and there's actually a little pivoting rivet right here. And so when you move the switch, it moves the second set of 4 contacts. Either it closes it, and the rotary contact that's on the motor behind this plate, which you'll see in a minute, will rotate and ring 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 again. Or if you move it in the 4 note position, it basically lifts this up out of the way, and as the contact rotates, it does 1, 2, 3, 4, but when it moves into this area, the contacts are out of reach and you don't get the last 4 notes. So it's a clever design. It was probably more of a reliable design. I know that when we take it out and it comes time to clean it, it's a heck of a lot easier to clean than the other type is. So that much I like. There is this assembly right here. There's this sort of copper colored piece of springy metal, and there's a matching piece on the other side, and the only purpose that this has is that when you close it, it helps make sure that it aligns it correctly across the surface of the board, and also the little notch right here make sure that it sort of locks it in place so it doesn't inch up over time on its own. So it's sort of a locking mechanism here. Again, like in all of these videos, when I show you things and talk about how to service them and you watch me do it, you must be very, very careful. This is an irreplaceable part. It's not available any place to buy that I know of unless you buy another chime base like this and scavenger it out of the base. So we have to be really careful with it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove this from the back of the motor assembly, because what I want to do is get the big chunky motor out of the unit because it makes it awkward to move it around. So to remove the contact switch assembly, it's held onto the back of the motor plate with, there are 3 Phillips screws. See, I was right, we did need a Phillips screwdriver. And all you have to do is loosen the screws, and each one should have a little star washer to help hold it in place. And of course we're going to put those in our cup. Sometimes the star washers get sort of embedded into the circuit board and you have to sort of pop them loose. You have to be careful when you do that because they'll go sproing. Sproing is a technical term. Oh wait, okay. And it'll jump across the garage or the workshop or wherever you're doing this, across the kitchen floor, and you'll never find it. So fortunately, star washers are readily available. You can buy them at your local hardware store. Anyway, this last one is kind of down in the corner here, and it is kind of buried underneath the wire leads. So you need to be careful because we don't want to stress the wires in any way. Because if you break it off, break them off, or they come loose. See that one, the washer kind of fell down. This is of course a little harder to do when you're making a video because I'm not really standing in front of it or over it. I'm off to the side. You've heard me say this before if you watched any of my videos. There's the washer. So if you drop something like a washer, you should stop immediately and go find it. Don't say, oh, I'll do that later, because you'll never find it. So there's that one. That goes in the cup. Now our contact assembly is loose, and our motor is almost loose. Let's look at what's on the back side here. I'll try to hold it in place so you can see. So with the contact assembly out of the way, you can see the back of the motor plate. And what we have here are two things. This is the rotary contact point assembly. It's this round metal disc, and it's attached to the motor shaft right here in the center. And then it has this springy contact point that's riveted onto the disc. And then here, this assembly is a switch assembly. It's the stop-start switch contact point, and it's the continuous run contact point assembly. This is very important. These metal arms, so this is a plastic or phenolic resin or Bakelite block assembly here, and then these metal arms are, one is screwed and the other ones are, I think, riveted in place somehow, and these cannot get bent. If you bend these out of shape, it's not going to work right. It's a fairly close tolerance for the type of device that it is, so care must be taken with this. This is held onto the back of the motor plate with one screw, and we'll use our larger flat screwdriver. Take this out. And like always, there's a star washer underneath it, goes in the cup, and then this comes off the back of the motor plate. Let's see if I can do it this way, like this. There is a, so if we turn it over, there's a little alignment post here at the bottom. This hole in the top is where the screw went through. This is the point that sits against the motor plate, so it goes this way, and there's a hole in the motor plate here so it lines up correctly. This can just be placed out of the way. One of the things to be careful of is all of the wire assemblies in these chimes are all cloth wrapped wire assemblies, and the wire, they're all stranded wire, so they're reasonably sturdy, but you don't want to be bending them or twisting them or doing anything with them more than you have to, because you don't want to break wires off. If you haven't done this before and you don't have another example like, say, that I do, you might want to take your phone and take some pictures of where the wires go and the wire connections, so in case a wire did happen to break off, you know that the yellow wires go to that point there and you can fix it or make a drawing or do something, because you won't remember, trust me. So the last bit we have to do is we need to unsolder the red and yellow wires that go to the motor coil so we can get the motor off this thing. This is our motor coil, and here are the two power wires that are soldered on the tabs of the motor coil, and what we need to do is carefully desolder the wires from these and take them out of the tabs, so then we can take the motor off. The easiest way to do that is you have to think about, you're dealing with solder that's 60 years old, and who knows how well it was done in the first place. So oftentimes the best way to do this is you start by using, you need a soldering iron to do this. You heat it up a little bit, and we're going to put a little bit of fresh solder, and that way it will mix in with the really old solder. Like that. And that gives you a better connection. Now, what I'm going to do, because normally what I would do is use my Hakko FR400 desoldering vacuum pump tool and do it that way, because that's quick and easy. But I know nobody else has one of those watching this, so we're going to do it old school way. I've got some solder wick. It's upside down, like that. Solder wick. Solder wick is just braided copper braid. How about that? There it is. Let's see if you can actually see it. It's braided copper braid, and it has flux on it, and you put it on your solder joint and heat it up, and it sucks up the solder. So you just place it over the top of the joint and you put your soldering iron on it, and as it sucks it up, the braid will turn from copper to silver because it's filling up with solder. And you want to be careful because it does get hot, because the copper transfers the heat pretty well, and it sucked up the solder. So now you can see how it's all full of solder. It's silver now, like that. Okay, so that one's desoldered. I need to get my magnifiers so I can actually see. And sometimes the wire, there'll be just a little bit of solder left, and if you use the tip of your soldering iron, you can sort of touch it and melt it a little bit and then push it down out of the hole. So you can see this one's loose now. So now I'm going to do the yellow one. When your solder wick is, the end of it's full of solder, clip it off and then start with a fresh end, because there's no reason to be heating up all that length of solder or wick, because it just makes it harder to get the next blob off. So we'll do the same thing. You want to try to do this reasonably quickly, because we don't want to heat up the coil contact point any more than we need to. So that one should be alright. So we'll get the little bit of wire out of there now. Alright, and then we'll push this aside. And then the wires go through, so this is the motor mounting plate, and the wires go through holes in the plate, and what you need to do is just sort of pull them through, and finally we can take our motor assembly off. Alright, so now we've got our motor assembly taken off the chassis, which is great because it makes the chassis a lot lighter and easier to deal with. You don't have this big lump on the end making it all hard to manage. So I'm going to put the chassis assembly aside for a minute, because we're going to work on the motor assembly first, and I'll explain why that should be the next step. What I want to do, part of the repairing and servicing of the chime, is we need to service the Telecom gear assembly that's that's part of the motor. And to take the motor off the motor mounting plate, we need to take the rotating disc off the motor shaft. And that's where our 1.25 millimeter Allen wrench key comes in handy, because there's a set screw. Oh, and let me point this out. This is a good sign. So we can take the disc and spin it, and it's like those old friction cars that you had when you were a kid, the kind that you wind up on the floor and then let go and they shoot across the floor. That's a lot sort of like what's in here. And if you can take one of these and you can spin it with your finger and it has momentum, that's a good thing. So this gear assembly will service up just fine. Anyway, back to removing the disc. So the disc is held onto the motor shaft with a little tiny Allen set screw right down in here. That's really, really hard to see. It takes a 1.25 millimeter Allen wrench key to get it out. And no, you cannot use a screwdriver, because if you strip it out, you may not be able to get it off, and then you can't take the motor apart. And also, then you'll need to find one of these to buy somewhere to replace it, and I got no idea where you're going to do that. So you need to do this carefully. So all you have to really do is put the Allen wrench key in and turn it a little bit, and then carefully slide it off the motor shaft. Fortunately, the hub of the disc is brass. I think it's brass. They always look like brass. And it never seems to be frozen onto the motor shaft, which is probably steel. So that's a good thing. Once you get this off, this is going to get cleaned totally. And then the thing that I do is use your Allen wrench key and screw it back in until it's just snug, to make sure it doesn't accidentally wind out of the hub and fall on the floor, and then you'll never find it. So it's just safe. This goes in the cup as well. That's going to get cleaned later. Now that we've taken that off, now we can take our Telecom motor assembly apart. Oh, and put your Allen wrench key somewhere safe, because you're going to need it again, or again and again. Alright, so taking the motor assembly off the mounting plate is actually pretty easy. There are two large screws at this end that hold down the motor data plate, and we're going to loosen and take those out. These are large, sort of fine threaded screws, and they come off pretty easily. For the sake of originality, you want to make sure that you remember that the motor plate goes with the writing at the, so you can read it with this at the bottom. Don't put it on upside down. This goes in its own cup because it's big, and once you get that off, the motor plate comes away. These brass standoffs, these are like riveted or smashed over on the back to hold them on. I don't know what that process is called. Anyway, these don't come off. Don't bother. You don't need to. This is all fine. And this actually says on the plate right here, it says switch mechanism, US and foreign patents pending. So I guess it's a patented design. What do you know? We'll put this off to the side, and then we've got our Telecom motor assembly. The motor assembly is pretty straightforward. You have a coil assembly here, you have the frame of the motor here, and you have the Telecom gear drive in the center. We need to take this out of the frame assembly. Sometimes you can just wiggle them out, like that one came out pretty easily. Sometimes what you need to do is loosen one of these screws that holds the coil to the frame. These most of the time have never been loosened, and they do have nuts on the back, and there are washers, of course, because back in those days everything had washers. And once you don't take it all out and everything, just loosen it a little bit, and then you can just spread the frame apart a little bit here at the center, and then it comes right out. This we're not going to do anything with more than just wipe it off. They get kind of oily, and we're just going to wipe it and clean it up a little bit. So this just gets put off to the side. You can actually, if you want to, put it in a cup. How about that? Alright, so now we have our Telecom gear drive assembly. As I showed you, this one actually spins pretty well, and it has momentum. So I'm just going to clean up the surface of this to get the grime and stuff off of it. And then we have another video, which I will put in a link in this video's description down below, or if I can figure out how to do it, I'll put it right in here in this video, because there is a way to do that now. These are the same type of motor assemblies that are used in NuTone kitchen wall clocks, and I have a video that shows how to service these. And basically what we're going to do, I'm going to clean up the surface, get the grime off of it. I'm going to take it, put it in a metal cup like always, and then I'm going to take it and put it in our repair shop toaster oven. And we're going to toaster oven it just like I do in the other video, and to find out the details you'll have to watch it. And then when it comes out of the toaster oven after about 45 minutes or so, we're going to use our 3-in-1 oil. And what you do is, while it's hot, it's important to do it while it's hot, and it has to be standing straight up like this, so the motor shaft is pointing up. You spray a little bit here on the hub assembly. The idea is that this gear drive assembly, when it was manufactured, is full of grease, and heating it up melts the grease and makes it redistribute amongst the gear drive that's inside the case. And then when you put the 3-in-1 oil, as this unit begins to cool down, so when you heat it up in the toaster oven, it all expands and the grease inside melts, and then as it cools, everything starts to contract, and if there's oil puddled up around here, the 3-in-1 oil, it pulls a little bit of it down inside. So you have to spray and wait and spray and wait and spray and wait and spray and wait, and you have to do it a bunch of times, so you have to pay attention. I'm usually doing it while I'm working on other parts of the chime, and it will pull a little bit of the 3-in-1 oil down into the gear drive assembly, and it helps thin out the original grease a little bit, and then it will be fine. So that's it. But if you want to see all of the nitty-gritty details of that, watch the other video. So I'm going to clean this up and go do the toaster oven thing, and then I'll be back. Alright, one last thing about the Telecom gear drive. I cleaned the outside of this up so it's not greasy or grimy as much anymore. This is a sealed unit. These were not designed and never were to be opened up once they were manufactured. So do not try to pry this apart and take it and open it up to see what's inside, because if you do, you will ruin it and it will never work again. So these are not designed to be opened up. These were supposed to last for a lifetime. How long the lifetime was, I don't know. But anyway, don't open them up because you'll ruin it. So off to the toaster oven. Alright, I'm back. So our Telecom gear drive assembly is in the oven toasting away. Now it's time to move on to the chassis assembly. The first thing I like to do on these is I like to replace the grommets that hold the solenoid assemblies in place. The thing I like to do after that is to clean the solenoid bores, and I find that it's easier to do the cleaning if these are held in place nicely, and replacing the grommets makes that so much easier. So that's the part I like to do next. And I always start in part of doing this all the time is you develop routines and patterns that work well for you, and I always start at the right and work this way. One of the things that you'll notice if you're paying attention is that the screws on these three sets, this is solenoid 1, solenoid 2, and solenoid 3. Solenoid 4 has different screws with flatter heads, and there are supposed to be grommets. There aren't any here on these at all, and this is all very loose. These screws are different, I think, and it just makes sense because this is where the motor sits, and you need the little extra clearance, and you don't want the screw heads touching the motor because that would transmit vibration and who knows. Anyway, that's the way it was done. That's the way we're going to leave it. So the first thing to do is to back out the screws. These are all slotted screws, and we're going to take them. Wait, we're running out of cups. Alright, so we'll put it in the cup, and this one goes in the cup, and then there are these little brass ferrules. That's what I call them. I don't know what the exact name of these parts are. They're these little cup-shaped brass goodies that are kind of shaped like the top of the grommet, and then they have a post in the middle that the screw goes through, like that. Like that. And the point of these is so if you didn't have this, the head of the screw would just go down through the hole in the grommet. Here's our grommet, and this goes like this. So as you tighten the screw, it will sit, the ferrule sits on top of the grommet, and as you tighten it down, the little post here at the bottom hits against the metal chassis here, and you can only tighten it so far, so you don't over tighten it, I guess is the point. There's one. Lots of times, since the grommets have all turned to little chunks of tar, they'll be part of a grommet top inside the bottom of these, and you kind of have to peel it out. By the time you get done doing all of the grommets, you'll have all these grommet chunks all over your workbench. So there's one, and here's the remains of the grommet, and the way I take those off is I have this wide flat X-Acto knife blade, and I sort of go like this, and you kind of chisel them off, and then you carefully have to turn it over and lift the solenoid out without stressing and breaking the wires. You have to be careful when you do this. The point here is to make this better, not to make it worse. Sometimes the remains of the grommets are stuck on top of the solenoids. Sometimes they're stuck inside the bottom of the chassis. So it just depends on how it works out. And of course these are just nasty. Anyway, so we'll see if we can get these to come off. I find that the blade like this, it works really well. It doesn't break it up into as many pieces, and that's good. So there's the beginning of our pile. And see, I broke my own rule. I let the solenoid flop around, and I didn't do that on purpose, really. I didn't do it just to show you, but I did. Or not. I don't know. It's for you to decide. This wire came loose right here. So now we're going to have to fix that, but we're not going to fix it till we put our new grommets and put the solenoid back in. Who knows? You'll have to figure out how that happened exactly. Alright, so now we have our two holes where the grommets are going to go. We should make a little bit of an effort to clean this up as we go, because it's easier that way. So we'll use a little bit of our alcohol because that works really well. And we're just going to sort of clean around this part of it. See? Dirty. I do not recommend that you take all of these out and do them and take them all apart at once and have everything bouncing around loose. Do them one at a time because it's easier. So we're going to put on 2 new grommets. These are my grommets of choice. As I've explained in other videos, the world of grommets is vast and complex. There are probably 1 billion grommets in the world. Trying to find exactly the right one can be difficult. If you need grommets, you can always contact me because we buy them a lot. In fact, I'm going to order more on Monday because we're starting to run low on our grommet supply. And I think the next time I buy grommets, I'm going to buy, I don't know, 300 or 400 probably. And that way you get more for the same shipping, so that's a good thing. Anyway, so if you need grommets, you can call me and I'll sell you some grommets. Anyway, so we have to put the grommets in the hole. This part's always interesting. What I like to do is I put them in, you make up a little soapy water. You put a couple drops of dishwashing soap in a little cup with some water, and it makes it kind of slippery, which is more exciting when you go to put them in because they fly across the room because they slip out of your fingers. It helps get the grommet, and this part's really hard to show because you got to hold it and you got to get it in the hole. So you got to get it halfway, you try to get one side of the grommet in the hole here, and then the other side you use a small screwdriver, flat screwdriver, and you kind of put it in the slot of the grommet and you push it and you maneuver it and try to get it into the hole. Like that. And that one actually went pretty well. The more you do this, the better you get at it, but it's still kind of difficult. And once you get it so it's basically in the hole, what I like to do is take this small, this is an ultra tiny little nut driver, and you sort of put it in the hole and you do this, and it kind of stretches it out into the hole in the metal and makes the hole in the middle even again, and that's good. Sometimes you have to flip it over on the back if the part of the grommet that's on the back side of the chassis, if it's kind of folded under, you flip it over and with the screwdriver kind of untuck it and then it pops out. So there's one. And here goes the second one for solenoid number 1. And sorry, I know it's hard to see, but there are some parts of this that are just really hard to show. Alright, and there's number 2. Those went pretty well. We'll open that up. I always take my rag and I wipe off the water and stuff that's left. Alright, so there's one, and then what you do is you flip it over and you put the solenoid back in place. You have to put the front of the solenoid tube back through the hole in the chassis and hold it in place. Don't get the wires that are all running all over this place here. Don't get it trapped underneath the solenoid because you don't want to pinch the wire. And then you turn it back around and you look down in the holes of the grommet and you get the screw holes in the solenoid bracket lined up. And then you put your ferrule and then you put your screw and then you use your screwdriver. And I always start one and then start the second one. And when you tighten them down, you can feel it when the ferrule starts to bottom out. And I go till you can feel it start to touch, and then I go a little bit more, just part of a turn more. Okay, and there's number 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video because you watching me doing all the grommets on this part of the chime is boring. So I'm going to turn off the video, I'm going to do the rest of the grommets, and then I'll be back. Wait, there's one more thing before I move on. I forgot. We have our mysterious broken wire. And this is a good lesson for everybody. Sometimes things happen. And where do the wires go? I don't know. What do I do? Well, okay. So the rule here is there are 2 wires for each solenoid because it's a coil, and a coil has 2 ends. So this wire here, under here, let me do it this way, this wire here goes up to a contact point on the switchboard here. This one, and well, let's look at it in a different way. This one goes up to the switchboard, and so where does this one go? Well, I don't know. So how do you figure it out? Well, let's look at the next one and see how that one's done. So here's solenoid number 2, and there are 2 wires here and here. So this one, if you follow it, it goes up to a contact on the switchboard, and this one goes over to here. And if you look at 3 and 4, they each have a wire that goes to the switchboard and a wire that goes over here. So since solenoid number 1 has a wire that goes over to the switchboard over here, guess where this one goes? I'm guessing it goes over here, because this is a common point with 1 wire from each solenoid, and it goes in this little rivet right here where it's supposed to be soldered in. So how are we going to do that? Well, how we're going to do that is we're going to solder it back in. And this will be actually should be pretty easy. Now that I've said that, of course, I've jinxed it. The wire here, this is a little tiny wire right here. It's like a little piece of magnet wire. This is probably like 32 gauge wire or something like that. It's very small. It's like the diameter of 2 hairs. It's very small. But we don't want to do anything. We're not going to do any more to it than we have to make it work. The first thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to take a little piece of our sandpaper that we keep on the workbench, and we're going to put our visor on so I can see it. And all we're going to do is we're going to wrap the sandpaper with the sandpaper side. We're going to fold it in half like this with the rough side inside the fold. And we're going to take it and we're going to put it around the end of the wire, and we're going to pull it and pull it and pull it like this a few times. And what that's going to do is, it's a copper wire, and it's going to clean off some of the oxidation that gets on the copper. You know how copper turns dark as it gets old? That's what happens to the wire. And so it's hard to solder a dirty wire, basically. You want it to be clean copper wire. So now we've cleaned the wire just a little bit. And we're going to take our soldering iron and we're going to put a little dab of solder inside the rivet. A little more. Because again, we're dealing with really old solder. And really old solder is a pain in the neck. So then we'll take our wire and we'll try to do this like it was done. And all you got to do, very carefully, again, hard to do when you're in the wrong place. Anyway, so we'll do that like that, and we'll touch the solder, stuff the wire in there, and our wire is back in place where it belongs. What do you know? So that thing I overlooked, or maybe not, who knows, is now repaired. Moral of the story is, if something like that happens, just like when I dropped the star washer earlier, don't say, oh, I'll leave that for later because that'll be easy, I'll just remember to do that, because you won't, or you won't remember where it went, or whatever it is. Fix it as you go, because if you fix it as you go, now you don't have to think about it anymore. It's all taken care of, so now you can move on. I'm going to do the rest of the grommets and then I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. I've got all 8 of the grommets for the solenoids all installed, and here's our pile of crusty grommet pieces that came out of the chassis. In fact, number 4 over here, one grommet was missing altogether and somebody had put a piece of some kind of foam or junk in there. So there's that. Since we're dealing with grommets right now, we should also look at our motor plate. If you recall from the beginning, the first part of the video, our motor plate was all flopping around in the chassis because the grommets were all missing. So it actually goes this way. So we're going to replace the grommets. Before we do that, we're just going to clean this up just a little bit because it tends to get kind of greasy or oily from the motor assembly and the gear drive over time. This is just alcohol, which works really well. And we just spray a little bit on the front and on the back and wipe it down. This is what I call practical chime repair. We're not doing a 100-point restoration, and this is not going to go in a museum. This is to put in back in somebody's house so they can actually use it. And the trend nowadays is people like things to be, sometimes they're referred to as, they want them to be original, and they want them to show their age and be, I hear people talk about, oh, it has that sweaty original look. So there you go, sweaty and original. Not oily, looks much better than it did before, and not dirty either. The grommets that go in on the motor plate are exactly the same grommets as the solenoid ones, and they go in these little sort of keyway slots here, and all you have to do on these is you just sort of roll them in from the edge and push them in place. When you put the screws and everything back to hold the motor plate back onto the chassis, they'll adjust themselves and it'll be fine. So we'll put those in there like that. And now we have proper grommets on our motor plate, so it'll be held in place properly and it won't transmit as much noise while it operates. So we'll put that aside. The next thing I like to do is we're going to move on to cleaning the solenoid bores. The front caps have all been removed. That was probably done by the owner. So what we need to do next is remove the remaining rear caps. There's 3, so let's go ahead and do that. This is usually not terribly difficult to do. What you need is a small pair of needle nose pliers, and you sort of insert it into the hole in the end of the cap and rotate slightly and slide them off. And of course, once you've taken them off, we're going to put them in our cup because we don't want to lose them. So there's 1, 2, 3's already been taken off, and 4. Now, if you were doing this to your own chime, when you take these off, what you're going to find inside usually is the remains of the original cushion. This is not an original cushion. This is some piece of foam thing that somebody put in there. This is not really appropriate, so that's trash. And then once you take the, in fact, this one's got a chunk of something in it. See, this one's got a piece of, let me push that out. It's got a piece of foam stuck down inside of it. There. So that's no good. The rest of them are clear. Normally when you take the caps off, you'll have the remains of the original cushion, which at this point, it was some kind of rubber or foam, or I don't know exactly what it was because I've never seen one that was new, but it's like the grommets. They turn into these little hard pieces of charcoal, and lots of times you have to take your screwdriver and kind of break them out and pry the chunks out. So you can get, because after you take those out, what's inside the solenoid bore will be the plunger, and then in front of the plunger is the spring. So as you take each one out, you have to chip away the old cushion, and then you have to push the plunger out from the front with a screwdriver because it'll be kind of stuck usually, and then you have to sort of bang it or shake it or carefully with a screwdriver make the spring slide out also. So as you disassemble each one, you end up with a cup full of caps, a cup full of springs, and a cup full of plungers, and you have to do them one at a time. This one was already taken apart when it was sent to me, so that's the way it is. It's not always necessary to take the front caps off. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. We'll talk more about caps later on when we go to reassemble, but for right now, these are all empty, and at this point, now we can start actually cleaning some things up. And I think what we're going to clean up first are the contact board contacts and the start-stop switch, or the stop-run switch. Alright, so here's our contact point board assembly, and this is the side that was concealed when it was in place. And what we have here are our movable portion of the board assembly with the 4 and 8 note switch here, and we have our 8 contact points. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and these are the contact points that the revolving disc touch to make the chime ring in the correct sequence. So as you can maybe see, I hope, these are all very dirty, and they tend to have some amount of carbon buildup. They also tend to get kind of greasy. It's from oil from the motor assembly, and this just needs to be cleaned. So the way I like to do this is we'll put it on a rag like this, and first I spray it with a little alcohol. Alcohol is a good general purpose cleaner, and then that's where our toothbrush comes in play, and you can just lightly scrub it. We're not going to get all crazy on this. Again, irreplaceable item unless you rob one off another unit, which most people aren't going to do. And so that cleans away. We'll wash it a little bit. And you can see here on the rag all the dirty stuff that came off. And the kind of nice thing about the alcohol is if you just sort of wipe it, it evaporates really quickly. And all of a sudden, this is at least 200 times better than it was before we started, but it's not really good enough. It needs to be better than this, because once we put this back together, it should not have to come back apart for a really, really long time. So what we're going to do is, this is where our Simichrome polish comes into play. Simichrome polish is it's made in, where is it made? It's made in Germany. It's good. It says a soft paste polish for chrome, silver, aluminum, brass, virtually any metal. Cleans to a brilliant shine and leaves a protected film. Made in Germany, imported by Competition Chemicals in Iowa Falls, Iowa. Everybody's got a relative in Iowa, don't they? I used to use this back when I was in high school. I had a 1968 MGB. Back in the days when cars had chrome bumpers, and you would always polish your chrome bumpers with Simichrome because it made them look really nice. This is what we're going to use to clean the contact points on the board here. So what you do is you take your Simichrome, and I use these are little textured cleaning cloths that I have. I bought a whole bunch of them a long time ago. It's like a lifetime supply. You can use any kind of paper towel or whatever you've got. These have sort of a textury kind of thing on them, and they don't leave pieces of it on whatever you clean. All you need is a little dab of the Simichrome, little. And then all you have to do is polish the contacts. Reminds me of when I was in high school. So we'll do the first 4. And we'll do it again. And you can see it takes off a fair amount. We'll take our, just to show you, we'll just wipe it clean a little bit for the moment. And you can see, I hope, nice and shiny, like the bumper on a 68 MGB. Or over here, not so shiny, like my sister's car. She never cleaned it. It's well worth, what did that take? 30 seconds? So we'll take another one. If you're really economical, you can turn it around the other way and use it the other side. I don't do that. Do the other side, polish it, now I appreciate this design because if you watch the 1947 K model chime servicing video with the multi-point rotary switch assembly with the moving disc in the middle, this is way, way easier. Those are a real challenge to get to all the surfaces because it doesn't come apart and you have to try to get down inside and turn it and clean it, and it's just, they take a long time. These I like. These are, whether these are better or not, it's up for grabs, but I can tell you these are a lot easier to clean. So now it's nice and shiny. I like that. So once you get it all nice and shiny, what I always do is sort of wash it off a little bit, because you don't want to leave any residue. You want to have it be clean. Like that. Okay, so that part's done. How easy was that? Alright, now, next part, a little more tricky, but not terrible. Get that wire out of the way. Now, we've got the run, this is the run stop switch assembly. The one that you're not supposed to bend the metal parts on. They have to be like this. Don't bend them. It'll mess things up and you'll never get it right. You've got a plastic or Bakelite body. You've got this contact lead on this side with a yellow wire soldered to it. You've got this contact lead on this side with a black wire soldered to it, and it all is kind of nasty. It's got oil on it, it's all oxidized, it's turned black, it's just in really rough shape. Here's how you clean it. We're going to use our Semichrome polish again, and we're going to start. Now, technically, the parts of the switch that matter are this contact surface here, the angled part on what would be the left-hand surface of this metal contact, and the left-hand surface contact of the curvy part of the other contact surface. The rest of it, it doesn't matter because nothing's touching it. It's just what the electricity flows through. It flows through the metal contact. But, you know, if you're going to do this, you might as well try to clean it up nicely. So what I'm going to do is, we'll start with this, and you have to be careful when you hold this. You don't want to bend it. So what I like to do is you kind of get your finger under there to support it, because you've got to push on it a little and try to do that. Now, you saw what it looked like when before I started. Here's what it looks like now. It's clean, it's shiny, it's like really, really, really good. And that's what it's supposed to look like. You're not going to get a good electrical connection, especially on some kind of friction connection, when you've got all that crud built up on it after 50 or so years. This one's pretty easy to do. This one down here is harder to do because you got to deal with the curved surface, and while this contact is heavier, it's thicker metal than this one is, you still have to support it. You can do some of it sometimes. There is no one single way to do this. You have to do what works. So what I do is I kind of hold it like that, put my thumb under it, and you clean it like this the best you can. And again, this is not like it takes 3 hours to do this. You're seeing it live as I do it. Unless you're watching it when it's recorded, then it's not live. But it was live when I was doing it. Alright. Oh look, clean and shiny. But not so clean and shiny under there. And I don't like to leave it that way. So what I do is, I have these little weird flexible little bristle brush things. Came in the cleaning kit with the textured cloths. So I'll put a little Scotch-Brite on it. It's like a little bottle brush kind of thingy. And you can kind of put it in between, in the inner surface, where it's hard, you can't really get your finger in there because it's too small. And you sort of clean it back and forth, and surprisingly enough, you can do a little bit on the end too. And then we'll flip it over and we'll do the inside of the other one, giving it some support as we clean it. And then, just for good measure, we'll put a little more. We're going to do the back side of the curvy one because, like I said, I don't like leaving it looking dirty. And this isn't that hard to do. So it fits really nicely in the concave part of the curvy part, like it was made for it. And then a little bit of this on the flat part. I'm not going to get too crazy up here about where it's attached to the block. Or maybe I am. I have a hard time leaving things that are not well done. You can thank my father for that. And the other thing about all this is when we get this all done and we put this all back together, you won't even see this. It's hidden down inside. Alright, so now we've done that. Put that out of the way. Again, we're going to... Can you see? No. Hard to do. Okay, we're going to wash it off. And after we wash it off, we're going to just go over it with our toothbrush a little bit to scrub off whatever the alcohol didn't take off. Should always have a lot of old toothbrushes lying around. Alright, then we'll wash it off again. Alright, now put this out of the way. Put our cap back on. We'll dry it off just a little. If you want to get really fancy about it, when you use alcohol, the nice thing is if you have some compressed air, you can use the compressed air and it dries it off almost immediately.
This is a reminder. Remove the Telecom motor assembly from the toaster oven. This is a reminder. Remove the Telecom motor assembly from the toaster oven.
Alexa, dismiss reminder. That was my new shop assistant. Apparently the Telecom motor assembly is done. So I'll be back. I have to go get it out of the toaster oven. We don't want to get her mad. I'll be right back. Okay, here's our freshly baked Telecom motor assembly. It was in the toaster oven. It was at 350 for 45 minutes. And it's piping hot. And so we're going to take our 3-in-1 oil. And yes, I know there are other kinds, and I've had people leave me comments and send me emails, and I use this kind and I use that kind and blah, 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 blah. I like this kind. So that's what we're going to use here. And what you do is you spray a little bit right on the hub. And yes, it makes smoke because it's really hot. And some of it will burn away or melt away or whatever it does. And put a little more. And the whole point of this is you want to get it on the little hub in the center. That's the part we care about, and it sort of wells up on there a little bit. It'll do that more when it starts to cool down a little more. And you're not going to hurt anything by doing this because it's all full of grease anyway. The idea is to get the 3-in-1 oil to get sucked down inside of the gear drive because it helps thin out the grease a little bit to make sure that it stays thin enough so the gears can turn easily so the motor works the way it's supposed to. And this will take about, I don't know, 20 minutes. I can actually see, you can't see probably, but you can see the oil getting pulled down inside because it wells up and then it just disappears down inside. So this is part you kind of have to pay attention to it. What I normally do is keep adding a little bit at a time until you see it's not going down into the space anymore. So this is boring to watch, so I'll be back when I'm done with it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to clean the revolving contact disc. And we took this off of the back of the motor shaft, and you can see it's really dirty and it's got a lot of buildup on it, and it looks pretty nasty. So let's go ahead and get set up and do this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to lightly clean it off. We'll use the toothbrush. We'll clean off the back side, and then we'll do the top or the front. Now you have to be careful because it has this little springy part here, and you can't bend this. It's flexible for a reason, and you can't bend it. So you have to work on this carefully, because if you bend it out of shape, you're going to be in trouble because it's not going to work right. So a little alcohol spray, a little toothbrush action here. Rinse it off, and that's much better already. It took off a lot of that surface grime, but that's not going to be really good enough. So now what we're going to do is, just like we did before, we're going to take our Simichrome polish, and we're going to find our little cleaning cloths. And I don't need a big giant one, so I'm just going to cut a piece off. And again, even though you're not going to see this when it goes back together, we want it to be in good condition. So we'll put a little Simichrome polish on our cleaning cloth. I'm going to do the back side first. And just to give you some idea, wash it and dry it, and I just did half of it. So guess which half I did? I did this half over here. So it doesn't take very long. Now, in my experience, the brass hub is always darker even after you clean it. I suppose we could go at this with some Brasso or something, but we're not going to get too silly about it. I think with the Simichrome polish will clean it up pretty well on its own. So let's get the rest of it done. And there is kind of an important bit to this we're going to get to at the very end. So we'll clean the rest of it. And the surface of the disc, the part I'm cleaning now, the flat part of the disc, it doesn't really have much to do with how the chime operates. Where's my little brush here? But we still want it to be clean. I think one of the important reasons to clean it is just good general workmanship. The other reason to do it is if it's got like an oily residue or that kind of thing built up on it, you don't want it to, I don't know, migrate across the surface later on, and you'll find out why that could be a problem when we get done cleaning the other side. So what I did here was, that's pretty good. Alright, rinse it off. Dry it. How's that? Pretty shiny. So what I did on the hub is I used a little piece of 2000 grit wet dry sandpaper, and I just sort of lightly polished it up. If you want to get real fancy about it, it's not like anybody's going to see this except me, but even so. I think the disc is aluminum. I remember when I did the first one of these, this style, I thought it was probably something else. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I've cleaned enough of these now where it seems that it's aluminum. So there's the back side, all shiny, and you can compare it to the front side, which is still all pretty crummy looking. So what I like to do is I'm going to do the flexible part first. It's the tip of the flexible part right here that's most important. There's a little dome-shaped bump right here, and then there's a ridge that goes down here. And it's the ridge part that makes the contact on the 8 points on the switchboard assembly, and that's the part that counts the most. But like we do here, we're going to clean the whole thing up so it's in good shape. Now you have to support this, the springy part, when you do this, so I just put my thumb under it a little bit to hold it. And I'll do the flat part, and I'll use my little bristle brush here. I guess I should have put the latex gloves on. Remember I said there was a messy part? This is kind of the messy part, but I didn't. And then, since I've got the bristle brush out already, and I'm already holding it, try to get the flat parts of the disc cleaned off. And underneath the springy part where you can't really get anything well. These little brushes work really well for this. And then this side, try not to drop it. And pretty much the more you work at it, the better it's going to come out. And again, how long did that really take? It didn't really take that long. So if we suspend it on that, we can wash it off. And of course, when you do that, you get a little on the back side again. You got to clean it. You know, you just work at it a little bit. All in all, what has this taken me so far? About 5 minutes, maybe. Not that big of a deal. All right. And again, most of this is for looks more than operation, because the disc and the hub and all like that. Let's not forget to do the underside of the pointy contact part right here, because again, you don't want anything to migrate from the dirty to the clean. And you've already got it all over your fingers, so you know you might as well. So it's just alcohol mostly and simichrome. It's not that bad. Alright, so we got all that done. So we've cleaned the disc, both sides. There's the back, shiny. There's the front, shiny. Cleaned the little contact point right there, but there's one other important part that has to be cleaned specifically. So the disc is actually one of the contact points, but it's not the flat part of the disc, it's the edge of the disc. So when this rotates, remember we have our run and stop switch. This rubs up against that and it makes a connection into the disc. So this edge has to be clean. If it's oxidized or has a coating on it of any kind, it's not going to make a good connection. So the last bit we're going to do with a cloth here is we're going to specifically and deliberately clean the edge, because it has to be clean. If it's not clean, it won't make a good connection, and then the chime either won't run, or as it's running and the disc is returning, it will hit a dirty spot and the chime will stall because it loses the connection. So you have to have it clean. I do not recommend, and I think it's a very bad idea, you don't want to use like sandpaper on this to clean it, because sandpaper is going to rough up the edge. And what you have to think about is there's electricity, it's an electrical connection, and while it's only 16 volts, it's 30 watts, and the 16 volts at 30 watts is enough power that you can, if you have a rough connection, you can get arcing. Arcing is like sparking, and every time it arcs, it eats the arc, or the spark will eat away at the contact surfaces, and it'll get more and more pitted and more rough, and then it wears things down and it creates a lot of problems. So you don't do that. You have to use something like a polish or a cleaner that's not going to affect the surface. Alright, so that's done. And we'll dry it off. And we'll put it back in its cup. Listen, that takes care of all of that, and we're almost done with the cleaning part. The next thing we have to do is we have to clean the solenoid bores, because they always have a lot of buildup inside of them. It's basically just a brass tube, and the electromagnet's in this part here. But the plungers have to fall through the tubes freely. There can't be anything that makes them hang up or any kind of resistance. And what gets in here is, it's the remnants of the original cushions. In this case, it's a lot of remnants of the foam that somebody put in as cushions. And also, who knows who's put what in there over the last 60 years. The plungers have to move through freely, so they have to be cleaned. So I'm going to set up to do that and show you how. To clean the bores, this is what you need. You need a pencil. This is a number 2. It's not a Ticonderoga. It's from Office Depot. A Ticonderoga probably works better, but this is what I've got here. You need your Ronson lighter fluid. This is the kind of lighter fluid that you put in like a Zippo lighter. So if you don't have this at home, go ask your granddad for some. He's probably got it. It's lighter fluid for a lighter. It's not lighter fluid for a barbecue. It's not paint thinner. It's not acetone. It's not lacquer thinner. It's definitely not WD-40. It's not any kind of oil. it's lighter fluid. This is what is recommended by NuTone to clean the solenoids, and this is what you're supposed to use. So it's lighter fluid. It doesn't have to be Ronsonol. It can be another brand. I don't care about that, but lighter fluid. And then you need some, this is 2000 grit wet dry sandpaper, just cut into little squares. You need 4 squares because you need 1 for each bore, because it's not one piece that's going to do them all. So the way you start doing this is you take the sandpaper and you simply roll it around the pencil to make a tube, and that just makes it easier, like that, and then take it off. It doesn't need to go around a bunch of times. In fact, if it does, it makes it too hard to get in the bore. So I trim it off so you only have a little bit of overlap, like that. Put it around the pencil. And of course, this is harder to do showing you than it is to do not. Then what I like to do is, I always start on this one first. That's number 1. That's just the way I do it. Take a little lighter fluid, put it in the bore, let it run out the other end. It's going to evaporate quickly, so that's a bonus. Then take the rolled up tube of sandpaper, roll it up small diameter tube, put it in the bore, because it's easier this way. Slide it in. Then you got to put your finger over the front so it doesn't fly out. Put the pencil in, and it turns out that if you do it right, the pencil and the sandpaper are the perfect size to fit inside the bore. And this is the way I've been doing it for 30 years. And then all you have to do is you can move it in and out, and you can turn it and move it in and out, and you work at it. And what you want to do is, what you're doing is you're honing or polishing, I think honing is the better term, the inside of the brass tube. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're removing anything that's built up on the surface of the brass tube. You're taking away all the tarnish and oxidation and whatever else is on it. And when you take it out, you'll have brass on the sandpaper, and the inside of the bore will be pretty much shiny. Shiny is good. We like shiny. And once you do that, then you take a little more lighter fluid and you can sort of squirt it in there to flush it out. And then what I'm going to do is, since somebody already took the caps off the front, I'm going to roll this back up and put this back in through the front. And do the front, because sometimes whichever end you put the pencil in tends to get the best honing. So if you do both ends, it's going to turn out better, I think. Yeah, see, nice and shiny in there. These inside, they're all dark and black. I know you really can't see very well. These are all black inside, and this one's shiny like shiny brass. Well, you know. So then we'll flush it out again. Now, so that one's done. Now, before I move on, let me show you, well, no, let's do it this way. I'm not going to show you each one, because watching me clean bores is boring. And there are other videos, if you want to see me do all of them, you can watch one of the other videos, because this is all pretty much the same. So I'm going to stop the video, I'm going to finish cleaning these, and then we'll move on to the next part. Okay, I'm back. So I've cleaned all 4 of the bores. Here's all of the sandpaper that I used up. That's all trash now. And to show you how clean they need to be, this is the way I judge it. So here's one of the plungers. This hasn't been cleaned yet. This is just as it came out of the chime. So here's what I do. I hold the chime up from the back, so each solenoid is horizontal or is vertical. And then you take the plunger tip down and you just drop it in through the back. and it should simply fall out. It should fall through with no stoppage. It should not hang up. It should not catch. It just goes boom and falls through. If yours do that, you're good. The bores are clean enough. That's all you have to do with those. Now we're going to move on to cleaning the plungers, and then I think it's going to be time to start putting things back together. So I've shown in other videos, I've shown different ways to clean these, and what I'm going to show you is my new preferred method to do this. I came up with this a while ago, and it works really, really well, and it's easy to do. So you need a cordless drill, and you take one of the plungers, and you carefully put one end in the chuck, and tighten it down so you've got some of it exposed. And if you look at this carefully, you can see that these are not horrible. These are not too oxidized or whatever. They're actually not terribly bad, but we still want to clean them up. So we take a piece of 2000 grit wet dry sandpaper, and we're going to just simply wrap it around the plunger and turn on the drill. And that cleans off the surface. It gives it a nice polish. You should also do the end, because the end, lots of times, remember we talked about the original cushion, how they turn to tar, or they turn to little chunks of charcoal. Well, they'll get stuck on the end here. You don't want anything to interfere with how this works. So you put the 2000 grit sandpaper on a rag, and you hold it like this. And that will clean off the end. You can see here the circle it left on the sandpaper where it cleaned off the tarnish. And if we take this out of the chuck and look at it, you can see here where it's all shiny where I cleaned it, and you can see here where it's dull, where it's still dirty, and now we need to do that end. So you just turn it around, put it in the chuck, and that's all you got to do. Now, here's one of the important parts. Like all things, you have to be careful when you do this. You don't want to do anything that's going to break off the little red tip. If you break the tip off, then you've got a real problem, because you can't buy these anymore. Then you have to make one, and you don't want to do that. So when you're putting this in and out of the chuck of the drill, you have to be careful so you don't break it. That's how you do one. Now I'm going to stop the video and do the other three, and then I'll be back. Okay, so I've cleaned all 4 of the plungers. One thing to know about the plungers, one thing that's important, is it has to do with the tips. So I'm going to set these up here. And I'm going to line them up so the solid ends are all in a row. In fact, we'll use the box here and we'll push them to make sure they're all even. Okay, so now you can see them up close. The left-hand edges are all lined up and even, at least, yeah, they are. And if you look at the tips, you can see this one and this one are about the same length. They stick out the same amount. This one and this one are shorter than the other two, even though this one and this one are the same. Ideally, they all should be the same length. And the reason that's important is because when these pop out of the solenoids, the red tips have to hit the brass tubes. And even though there's some in and out adjustment on where the brass tubes hang, ideally, if they all hang in the same adjustment spot, it's better. And so then the tips pop out the same amount and hit the tubes more evenly, and they all sound the same. I worked on some of these where these are pushed way back in, where there's only about half this much sticking out, and then they don't pop out far enough, and the customer's complaint on that chime was it doesn't have any volume. And there isn't volume per se. It's not like an electronic device, it's a mechanical device, and it was because even if you threaded the tip out, Once it hit the tube the first time, it would push it back in again. And then there's actually another video where I talk about that with the plungers. So you can watch that one if you need to know more. So what are we going to do with these? Well, we're going to see if we can adjust them. And the way we're going to adjust them is these actually, you can hold them and you can turn them, and it's actually threaded inside the plunger. And I don't know if they were threaded intentionally or whether it's, I think it was, because they all seem to be threaded inside. But like this one just pulls out. You know, that's pushed in as far as it will go, and I can just take it and pull it right out, and that's no good. This one seems to be tight, and that one seems to be tight, and this one pulls out. And that's why they're shorter, because they've struck the tube so many times that it's stripped the threads in the plastic tip, and they just push back in, and that's no good. So how are we going to fix this? That's a good question. Okay, so here's how we're going to deal with our slipping tip problem. We have two of them to repair, and this is the only way I've been able to figure out how to do this. Here I have some 2-part quick set 5-minute epoxy, and I'm just going to squeeze a little bit out like that, and put the cap back on. Try to keep it from drying out, and the stuff smells bad too. Then you have to mix it. Mixing epoxy is important. The better you mix it, the better it works. So you've got 2 parts. You've got the hardener and whatever the other part is. You mix it together, makes a chemical reaction, and that's what makes it get hard. If you don't mix it well, it doesn't get hard. It stays gooey and soft, and that's not what we're looking for here. And you always waste a lot. I'm just doing this on a scrap piece of anti-static bag that I have, because I'm just going to throw it away when I'm done. So we mix it up really well, like that. And I'm using this wooden end of a cleaning swab, because this happens to be exactly the right size. And what I should have done first was, these are just broken off, and what we want to do is I'm going to cut the end off straight. Take a little bit of the epoxy on the end of the wooden rod, and we're going to put it down inside the plunger. We don't need a lot. If you put too much, when you put the tip in, it squishes out and doesn't want to stay where you put it and all that. Take a little bit and put it on the end of the rod of the tip that you're going to put in the plunger, and then put it in. See, if you put, it makes an air pocket, so you push it in and it pops back out. So then you might have to wipe a little off and then do it again. You'll get it to a point where it will stay. Again, it's fussy to do. Sometimes when you have them where the threads will catch a little bit, it's a little easier. See, and then also in the contrary, so now it's in all the way, so it's kind of short. If I pull it out, the suction pulls it back in. So you've got to find that happy spot. So we'll let that one sit for a second. And then we'll put a little bit in the second one. And a little bit on the end. Put that in. See, this one worked a little better. Alright, so now clock's ticking. We got 5 minutes. So what we need to do is we need to line these up. We're going to use the 2 longest ones as our reference. And you might be thinking, well, you could measure them. Well, you could. Eyeballing it is fine, as long as you're good at that. How long are the tips actually supposed to be? How far are they supposed to stick out of the plungers? I have no real idea. There isn't anything anywhere that says how long they're supposed to be, and almost all of them are worn to some degree, so it's anybody's guess. I would say on an average, if I had to put a number on it, let's see what our calipers say on this one. I would say from the end of the plunger to the end of the tip, it's about 7.9 millimeters ish, 7.87, something like that would be good. Maybe they were about 8 millimeters when they were new and they've worn down a little bit. I'm not sure, but that, just eyeballing it and having done enough of these, that seems to be the amount I'm looking for. So then I'm just eyeballing them this way. You can actually use like the box as a straight edge and see which one's where. This one might be a little too much, so we'll see if we can just slide it in a little bit more. Now it's probably a little too short. Again, we line them up and we check them this way. I would say that's pretty good. Now, so let me get rid of the epoxy. You have to be really fussy about this, because if you're not and you get it wrong, then you got a problem. And what that problem will be is, okay, I think that's all right. Let me get rid of the epoxy. So here's the problem that you can create for yourself. If you don't get them in right, you've now glued them in place, and they were probably never glued in place before. The epoxy is going to set up. If they're wrong, the only way you can fix it is to break off the tip, use a drill bit, drill out the rest of the red plastic, then fashion a new tip and start and try again. It's not the hardest thing in the world to do, but it's a lot of extra work when it's easier to get it right in the first place. The other thing about having to do this on this chime or on any chime is that this is going to delay the final completion of this particular chime, because these have to dry. And even though it's 5-minute epoxy, 5 minutes isn't good enough. These are going to have to dry overnight at least, because if you don't let them dry enough and you finish up the chime and you go to hang it and test it, if they're not fully dry and set and held tightly in place, the first time it hits a tube, it's going to push the tip back in the plunger, and then it's glued, and then you're out of luck because it's going to be too short. Odds are you won't be able to pull it back out again, and then you have to break it off, drill it, make a new tip, and all of that. So this is now like a 24-hour thing as far as I'm concerned, to make sure that they are fully dry. And there's no getting around that. If you do it wrong, you're going to hate yourself tomorrow. I may not be able to show the final completion of it today, but we'll get on getting the rest of it put back together. Okay, so as a quick review as to where we are, this is what we've accomplished so far. We disassembled the chime altogether. We've disassembled the motor assembly. We've serviced the Telecom gear drive assembly. We've put new grommets on the motor plate. We've put new grommets on the solenoid bracket. We've cleaned all the contacts on the contact board and the run and stop switch. We've cleaned our solenoid bores, and we've cleaned our plungers, and we glued the tips that were too short in the plungers, and we've cleaned our revolving contact disc assembly. So now finally we get to start putting things back together. So here's what we're going to do first. First we're going to put the motor assembly back together, because that's the best thing to do at this point. This is our frame assembly with the coil. Here's our Telecom unit. This goes back in the end like this, and you just push it till it rests against these bars. so it's easy to know how far. You squeeze it together this way tightly, and you retighten the frame screw, the one that you loosened, so you could take it out. Alright, so now once you've done that, you need to put it back in the motor mounting plate, and there's a little in the center of the gear drive assembly, there's this little ring right here, and that ring has to fit through the hole in the mounting plate. Otherwise, when you tighten it all down, it's going to bend the plate, and you don't want to do that. So you just set it in there. You just set it in there like that, and then you put the data plate back on, remembering that the data plate, you're supposed to be able to read it in the same direction as the words on the coil, and then you put the screws back in, and they thread into the brass standoffs. They should go in easily. Please don't cross thread them and strip them out, because again, you'll hate yourself if you do that. And then tighten it down. These don't have to be super tight, they just have to be snug. There are no washers or anything on these, surprisingly enough. Like that. So that's all set. Now we have to put the revolving contact disc back on the motor shaft. Now, this part is important. Before you actually put that back on, even though we've cleaned this, what we're going to do is just to make sure, because at this point everything is pretty good, but once you put it all back together, a lot of this is hidden and you're not going to get a second chance to do anything with it. We're just going to take one of our little textured cleaning cloths here, and we're going to wipe off any residue that could be left. Because the Simichrome polish, when it dries, you get sort of that pasty, powdery look like when you wax your car. And you don't want any of that on anything, especially the edge. The edge, I like the edge. The edge is like really shiny and really reflective. And that's what you want, a nice clean contact. So this goes back on the motor shaft. So we need to back off our set screw that we just snugged in to keep from losing it. And then we slide it on the motor shaft like this. Now, this part is important. You have to, excuse me, you have to get the revolving contact disc in the right spot up and down on the motor shaft like this. Okay? If it's too far down or too far up, the flexible contact point here won't touch and move correctly, and then the chime won't ring properly. So how do you know? Well, you know because a long time ago somebody measured one, and the measurement is supposed to be, it's 6.45 millimeters. So we'll set the caliper for 6.45 and lock it in place. See, I think you can see that. 6.45. There you go. 45, 46. That's, you know, okay. And then we'll use so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the Allen key in the set screw, and I'm just going to lightly tighten it down just enough so I can still slide it up and down a little bit. Make sure that our calipers are set right. I need to put my magnifiers on so I can actually see it. And I'm going to measure it. And I would say that that's about perfect right there. Turn the Allen key to snug it up a little bit more. Check it again. That's fine. And then make sure the set screw is tight. And then, one more time, check it again. I think that's about perfect. Alright, so it's important to get it right. And if you spend the extra minute to do it now, you won't have to take the whole thing apart to reset it when it's wrong. And I can tell you from experience, it's no fun. Alright, so that's all done and back together and ready to go. Looks much, much, much better than it did before we started, so that's good. Now what we need to do is put the motor back on the chassis. Okay, so this part's fun. So here are our motor plate mounting hardware. We have 4 screws. Wait, there's only 3. Where's 4? Here's 4. We have our 4 mounting screws. We have our 4 brass ferrules for the grommets, and we have these 4 fiber washers that I just dropped on the floor. Wait, I gotta get it. Okay, so I found the washer. It rolled like 6 feet away. So you gotta find it right away. Don't wait, you'll never find it. You take the motor plate assembly and it sits in the chassis like this. And then you have to put the screws go through the brass ferrules like that. So we'll put all 4 of those together. Alright, so here's our motor and motor plate assembly. Here's the opening that it's going to fit into. Here's the hole in the chassis for the top right hand screw. So the way this goes together is you take the screw with the brass ferrule, it goes through the grommet on the front, and then you put the cardboard washer, and it goes on the back of the grommet, on the screw on the back of the grommet, and then it goes through the hole. Now some of these you have to thread the screw in, and some of them I think that I've worked on, they're kind of stripped out and the screws just push through the holes. So I am assuming that it was originally supposed to be threaded, because that makes the assembly of the whole thing easier, because it doesn't all want to flop around. The tricky part on this is you've got to get all 4 of them going at one time, and the thing's kind of moving around on you and all that. So I'm going to try to show you as much as I can. Again, it's hard to see. The bottom right one is the hardest one because it's down in here where it's hard to see. So if I turn it around this way, we'll do this top left one. So there's the screw in the ferrule, there's the fiber washer, line it up with the hole in the chassis, and start it. Leave it long and loose so you have room to do the bottom one, because the thing that's hard is you have to put the screw through and then you have to fish the washer in, and I'm probably not going to be able to show you that really well because there's only so much room. This is really exciting video, isn't it? Okay, so I've got all the screws and the ferrules and the washers on, and I've got all the screws started. So now we'll just tighten them up. And once you get them just moderately snug, you can sort of make sure that it's all sitting in there properly. And then again, you don't need to over tighten these. These just need to be snug, because ultimately in the end they're going to have nuts on the back. They're going to keep them all in place. So that's probably fine. Alright, so now our motor assembly is remounted. Now we need to put our contact board back on and get the backside buttoned up. The next thing to do is to put our run stop switch back in. And if you remember, there's a post on the back of the body of it, and that fits into the lower hole down there. So you can put that in place. And then put the screw with the star washer back in. And just snug it down. Doesn't have to be super tight. Then, before we put the contact board in, we have to put the red and yellow wires back through the motor plate for the coil, for the motor coil. And if I remember correctly, the yellow one goes on the left. These can be a little tricky to get through the holes because the cloth wrapping, the ends are frayed sometimes. You can't really see that. And so you got to kind of stuff it through the hole. It is an insulated wire with a cloth cover, and the cloth cover is, I think, there to help prevent the insulation over the wire from chafing and rubbing through. So you just pull those through some for now. We'll solder those later. Okay, so those are out of the way, and then you can tuck the wires up. For the most part, the wires go through this like channel here at the top and over the top of this screw, at least for now, to keep them out of the way. Now what we're going to do is take our contact board assembly and we're going to put that back in place. And so what you need to do is move the wires out of the way a little bit. Because you have to put the arm that operates the switch has to go through the slot here at the top. So you sort of put that through like that. These are the easy screws to remember which ones they are, because these are the ones that are Phillips heads. And you put the screws and the star washers back in. It's best to start them each first. This one being the trickier one down here because it's kind of behind all the wires. Make sure you don't pinch any wires under the screw or under the washer. And then just snug them down. They don't have to be super tight. Like that. And make sure that the switch assembly moves freely and the wires won't be in the way. We're not going to put the cover on the back yet. I always wait to do that till the very end after it's been tested. So the next thing to do is to deal with the solenoids and the plungers and the caps. So here are our 8 solenoid tube cap assemblies. And 4 of them are for the front of the tubes and 4 of them are for the back of the tubes. These are easy to tell which came from where, because the ones that were on the back, if we turn them over and look inside, these 4 are from the back, and these 4 are from the front. And the way I know that is these are all dark inside, and they have discoloration, and some of them had remnants of the original cushions, and they were all hard and stuck in there, and I sort of cleaned them all out. These are all pretty clean and shiny on the inside, which is what we want. This one in particular is pretty bad because it has a split here and it has a split on this side. The way these go on is they get pushed over the ends of the solenoid tubes on the front. Now, these are just a friction fit. So you just take them and you put them over the end like this and you push them on. And that one fits pretty snugly, and I like that. And this one, that one's not as great, but it's not too bad. This one, that one's really loose, and I don't like that. This one with the splits, surprisingly enough, that actually fits pretty well. This one that's loose, this is actually a pretty decent one, but it's loose. So let's swap that with one from the back and see if we can do a little better, and then I'll tell you why. And that one's kind of loose too. We want ones that are pretty snug, or at least the snuggest that we can get. Is snuggest an actual word? That one's way loose. Last one, let's see. That one's not too bad. Alright, so we're going to go with those 4 to start with. The reason it's important that they fit snugly and tightly is that when we reassemble this, we're going to put the spring in from the back, and then we're going to put the plunger in from the back. And the way this operates is the spring pushes the plunger to the back of the tube, and that's where it sits until it's energized, and then the magnetic force shoots it out towards the front to hit the tube. If the cap doesn't stay on securely, if it's not tight enough, the hammering force of the plunger as it fires and rockets forward, it will slowly knock the cap off the end. It'll push it, push it, push it, push it, and eventually it falls off, and then the spring and the plunger can fall out, even though the tube's in front of it, and that might keep it in. It's not the way it's supposed to work. These are supposed to stay on tightly, and I've actually seen these that when we're working on these and we're checking it without tubes, where a solenoid will fire and the cap goes like this and shoots across the shop. So that's no good. And oftentimes a lot of these on every chime they're split and they don't stay tight, and bending them, trying to make them be tight, doesn't work. I've already tried that lots of times. That doesn't really work out. What you can do if you need to, and I've done it a few times and it actually works pretty well, is you use a little super glue. And what you do is, and this is one of those definite is less is more projects. When you put the cap on the end of the solenoid, and we're going to do it on the back and pretend that it's the front one. When you put it on like this, what you can do is you can put one tiny, like really tiny drop of super glue right here where the end of the cap sits against the outside face of the tube. And I'm not talking about squeezing in a half a pint of glue and getting it all under the cap and it's glued for the ages and you'll never get it off. That's not the idea here. The idea here is you just need a little bit of something like super glue, sort of a little bit of a liquid mechanical fastener, and it will creep under the cap just a little, and we're talking about the smallest drop ever. People always tend to want to overdo everything, and then they get themselves in hot water over it, and then they don't know what to do, and then guess who they call? One of the tiniest little drops right here on the seam, and the capillary action of the super glue, it will get pulled under the cap just a little bit, and it'll be on the surface of the tube here, and it gives it, when it dries, like overnight, it gives it just enough of a bond that the cap doesn't want to come off on its own. If you needed to take it off, you can do it with a pair of needle nose pliers, but it helps hold it in place, and that's just sort of a good tip. So we've got the caps on the front. Now we need to deal with the back side of the assemblies. What we're going to do with those is the order that things go back in the solenoid tubes are springs, plungers, cushions, and caps. And that's what we're going to do next. Like many things that have to do with K-model early NuTone chime bases, there are no parts available, and we need cushions. I don't think that some kind of raggedy foam is going to cut the mustard here. So we're going to make our own. What I've got here is some fairly dense closed cell, some kind of drawer liner stuff that I found years ago that is sort of a modern day version, I think, of what was in there, and it seems to work pretty well. You can see I've already made some before. One of the things about the cushions is it's a round cushion, as you can see, but it needs to have a little vent hole in the back of it because you don't want to seal it up so well that it could create like a suction in the tube, and then the plunger loses power as it tries to rocket out of its position. So what we do is we have a little hole punch here, and we're going to punch a hole. As you can see, little vent hole right there. And then we're going to take our cutting tool, and this is specifically sized for the tubes on a K-model chime, and we'll place it, center it over the hole we just punched, and do like this. And then we'll have a cushion with a vent hole in it. So there's one. Time to work on the other side, I guess. Two. 3, 4, just like that. Alright, so now we've got 4 cushions. We'll put those over there. We'll put this over there. Now we can start reassembling. So what was the first thing that goes in? Oh, the first thing that goes in are springs. But we've looked at this guy's springs, the ones that he sent to me, and they're like really raggedy. They're stretched out and they're bent. There's one that's not bad, there's one that's missing, and there's 2 that are kind of mangled. And this isn't going to cut it. It's because the springs are important. It all has to work properly. So we're not going to use the original springs, but like other things. Oh, I forgot to mention. If you're doing your own and you need cushions, get a hold of me. I have cushions. I can make you some. Back to the springs. Look at what we have. What is this? Oh, look. It's a bag of springs. How amazing. Are these old springs? Are these springs from 1955? No, they're not. They're springs from, looky. It's a spring. What do you know? Can you see that? I don't know. Maybe down here. It's a spring. Are these 1955 springs? No. Whoop, there it goes. Got it. Caught it before it went off the bench. No, these are 2017 springs. And these are springs that we had made. And these are brand new. They're made out of stainless steel. They are exact copies of the original springs. They're not bent. They haven't been compressed a million times. They are accurate, true copies of the original springs. And we had these made. And we have lots of them. Lots more than this even. So now, when we have to repair someone's chime and it's missing springs or the springs are all mangled, we have springs. What do you know? We're so clever sometimes. I hope. Anyway, this is how you reassemble it. This one first, the spring goes in. Boom. Then we need our plungers. Oh, here they are. Now, even though they're not dry enough, in my opinion, to be used, they are dry enough now to be put back together. So then the plunger goes in, Watch this, it just slides in. Watch. Slide. See, look. And if you push it, oops, that screwdriver is kind of magnetized. That's not helping. Okay, let's try this one. That's better. If you push it, the spring makes it pop back out. How cool is that? And it sits mostly right in the back of the solenoid tube where it belongs. It's not a third of the way down because the spring's all compressed after 60 years. It's right where it's supposed to be. Now we have to put a cap on the back. So you take the cap and you put the cushion inside the cap first, and then you put the cap on the back of the solenoid tube like that. That's the way you do it. So there's one, and then that's a second spring. Must check something. Yeah, that's alright. Then the, oh, see how that one dropped in? That was good. That's the way it's supposed to go. Then the cap with the second cushion, you have to make sure that the cushions are sitting flat down inside the cap when you put them in. And then we'll put that on. And then we need 2 more springs out of our bag of springs. You probably don't realize what kind of absolute luxury having, if I can get them unwound. These always get tangled together, they get wound up. There's one. And you carefully have to like hold it and twist them to sort of unscrew them from each other. It's interesting. Good thing I had a slinky when I was a kid. Alright, there's 2 more. Put those back in there. Zip those up, put that out of the way. You don't know what an absolute luxury it is to say, oh, I need a spring. I think I'll go to my spring inventory for a 1955 K-model chime and fetch up 4 of them. You have no idea how much better that makes this kind of job. There's another spring and another plunger. See how that dropped in there? It went boom and it bounced on the spring? That's terrific. Alright, another cap, another cushion. Put it down in the bottom of the cap so it sits flat. Put that on. And then our last spring and our last plunger and our last cap. Put that on. And there you go. Now, these caps fit kind of loose also, although the hammering force of the plungers when the spring pushes them back is not nearly as strong as when the solenoids energize and shoot it out the front. However, if these seem to be too loose after we test it all and everything, then they may get their little drop of super glue also. You don't glue anything until you know for a fact that the chime actually works, because then you have to deal with taking it all apart to try to solve whatever's wrong with it. So don't do it now. Wait until you know the chime actually works. The next thing to do is we need to solder the wires back on the coil. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the ends of the wires back through the tabs on the coil. This part is not very exciting, you're not missing much. Just put it through the bottom and carefully bend it over the tab just a little. And then once it's sitting there, use your soldering iron and resolder it when you resolder it, you want to fill up the entire hole in the tab, so there's a lot of solder holding the wire in place. And then we'll do the red one the same way. Again, you're not missing much on this part. This part's kind of boring. But if you don't hook it up, it's not going to run. It would be easier to do if didn't have such big giant fingers. Alright, getting closer. Alright, better. Now, we can get it through the hole, we got it made. Sometimes if you growl at it, it makes it easier. Alright, now we'll solder that one. Okay, so that's done. Now, you might think, yay, we're almost done. Now we can try it out, right? No, not even close. While we have most of the repair done, there are still things that need to be done. Things that are left to be undone. Little things. We're missing a screw here on the rear door terminal, which I'll have to find one that fits. These are small, slotted, flathead, kind of flathead, machine screws. Has to be the right size. I have to come up with a switch for the light here because this one's all broken and I don't have that here at the shop. That's something I'm going to have to look at the office for in my spare parts. We still have to wait at least another 20 hours to let the epoxy dry on the red tips that we glued in place because I'm not tempting fate on that. Once we get those things done, I have to deal with the wiggly post somehow or another. Once we get those things done, then we can actually connect it up and see how well it works, and hopefully it does. So that's all for today. There will be another session on this chime, but I'm out of time and I don't have the parts to finish it here. I have to wait for the epoxy to dry. So that's all for today. The next time you see me, it will be to wrap it up and to hang it and test it and see how well we did. So see you again soon. Hi, I'm back. So it's the next day since the last section, and when I was at the office I found a replacement switch for the broken one here for the light, which I'll show you the light afterwards. I've got this set up here. I'm not going to put it on the test jig yet because there's a couple things I want to show you before I do that. Just to show you where we are with it as a short recap, even though for you it was only 3 seconds since the last section. Everything's been reassembled. I replaced the switch. I don't have the cover on the back of the contact board assembly yet, but I just wanted to show you that the plungers do operate. So you can watch them here, 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 and here. And I've just got this set up on the bench on a power supply. And if I touch the rear door button, this one will come out. And if I touch the front door button, it will run. It's set at 8 notes. It'll run through the sequence. So that's good. And when it reaches the end, the motor stops. And then we'll switch it to 4 notes and activate it again. And there you go. So it does function. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually show you how it works. So I'm going to set it down and I'm going to take the contact board assembly off the back of the chassis and show you how it actually operates. So what I've done is I've taken the contact board assembly off the back of the chassis so we can see the revolving contact disc and the start-stop switch that we clean and then put back on the back of the motor plate. I'm going to see if I can explain to you how this actually operates. The run stop switch has two contacts, and this is a switch. So you have contact 1 here and contact 2 here. There's a wire on each contact. So on contact number 1, the yellow wire goes down to the back of what is the front terminal over here, screw terminal. And contact number 2 here has a wire that goes over to the common terminal, which is one of your 2 transformer power terminals. This is wired in exactly in the same way as your front door push button would be. The wires from your front door push button get connected to the common terminal on the terminal strip, which would be the same as contact strip number 2, and the other wire from your front door push button gets wired to the front terminal, which is the same as contact strip number 1 over here. So this functions in the same way as your front door button. So when someone comes up to your front door and they push your doorbell button, it activates the motor and the disc turns. So we'll just let it turn once so you can see it go all the way around. And then it stops. So how does that actually work? Well, it works in this is a little complicated to explain. It's simple and it's kind of elegant in the way it operates, but it's a little hard to explain because you have to actually think about it for a bit about how it works. So right now it's at the beginning point, and what's difficult to see is in the revolving contact disc right here, there's this notch or cutout. And the curvy part, this part of contact number 2 in the run stop switch, it's actually not touching the contact disc right here. Contact number 1 is rubbing up against the edge of the contact disc. And remember, we talked about when we clean the contact disc, I said it was important to have the edge of it clean. That's because it's rubbing up against contact number 1, and contact number 1 is always touching the revolving disc. So what happens is when someone comes up and pushes your button on your front porch, it gives a little bit of power to the motor, so the motor starts to turn. As the motor starts to turn, it moves the cutout clockwise, and the edge and the upper edge of the cutout right there turns just enough where it touches the curvy part of contact number 2, and that closes the connection between contact number 1 and contact number 2, like I did just then. And it would be acting as if it's just like somebody was on your front porch pushing the button down and holding it all the time, because as long as these contacts are connected and they're connected through the edge of the revolving disc, it continues to run. As soon as it revolves around once and it breaks the connection, then it stops, and it stops with just the smallest of small gaps between the upper edge of the cutout and the curvy part of contact number 2. It's literally probably about, the gap is about as wide as the thickness of a sheet of paper. It's very, very, very small. And I think you can see in the video how small that actually is. It's just a switch, and it's operating just like the switch on your front porch. If someone was on your front porch and they push the button down and hold it continuously, it's going to turn on the motor and it's going to rotate, and it's going to keep going forever as long as someone's holding the button. This is the same, and I can show you that because if I take my metal screwdriver and I touch between contact number 2 and contact number 1 and close the switch, it turns it on. And then we're halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, it's coming to the end of the cycle, hits the gap, and it stops before contact number 2 has a chance to touch the edge of the disc once again. So, and as it rotates, the springy contact point right here touches the contact's points on the switchboard assembly or the contact board assembly, the ones that we cleaned and polished, so now they're all shiny, and as it makes the connection, it fires the solenoids, and that's what makes the chime operate. It's important, that's why all of this is really important, because this is a rather elegant design, but it's important to have clean contact surfaces so the contact between the switch doesn't become interrupted. If you had a dirty spot on the edge of the disc and the dirty spot revolved around and contact number 1 landed on the dirty spot, you could lose the connection between contact 1 and contact 2, and then it will stop because you've broken the connection of the switch. So that's why it's important that it be clean and to make it work properly. The other thing that's important is, if you remember when we put the revolving disc back on the motor shaft, it has to be the right distance from the end of the motor shaft. Otherwise, the contact point here doesn't touch the contacts on the contact board correctly. If it's too far down, if it's too far away, it'll miss these. It won't touch them. If it's too close, then it has a hard time moving over the little domes that make up the contacts. And also, I've seen if it's really pushing down on them too hard, it can get caught up on the edge of the little contact right here and has a hard time getting over it. So it all has to be done, has to be reassembled properly. As I always say, there's a lot more design and engineering that goes into this than most people would give it credit for, but that's actually how it operates. So it's very simple. Close the switch, turns it on, it runs through its cycle, and when it reaches the end, it will automatically shut off and be ready to go once again. Boom, there you go. How's that? You're probably the only people that have ever actually seen one of those in operation. So I'm going to go ahead and put the contact board assembly back on, and then I'll show you how to put the cover back in place, and then we're going to be ready for testing. So I put the switchboard assembly or the contact board assembly back in place, and I actually ran it through its cycle one time to make sure it's proper. And then the last thing we have to do before we get to put it on the testing jig and try it out is we have to put the contact cover back on here. And to do that, the hardware that we have left is we have 6 fiber washers and we have 3 little brass nuts. And those are the only pieces of hardware that are left over, which is the way it should be. It's not like one of those TV shows where you've got like 12 extra parts and you don't know where they go. We've actually reassembled it using all the parts that we took off of it. So the little fiber washers, this is actually pretty easy. If you look at the cover, there are 3 mounting points. There's one here, one down here. So it's 2 washers, 2 washers, 2 washers for 6. And the fiber washers are entirely just used as spacers, and they're used to move the cover plate away from the contact board assembly enough so it doesn't foul it up while it's operating. So you just put the 2 washers on each of the 3 screws. You have the little external front wire and terminal strip here. That'll end up on this mounting point right here. The other thing to note is on the cover there's a little cutout right here, and that cutout is where all of these wires right here need to be routed through so you don't pinch any of them. So it's just a matter, you actually have a fair amount of space there, so it's not that hard to do. All you have to do is line it up and slide it in place. This one's a little tweaky. It's been bent before, I think. But that's all you have to do is just slide it in place like that. Probably the hardest part for me are the little tiny brass nuts because they're really small. They're actually smaller than what they usually seem to be for some reason. So I'm going to see if I can use a nut driver. Sorry if you can't see this. There's that one. This is the hardest one to do because you have to put the terminal strip back on first and then try to get the nut on to hold it down, and that actually went better than average. So we'll tighten those down. Again, if you have a nut driver, it makes this a lot simpler than doing it with like a pair of needle nose pliers. This doesn't have to be super tight, these just have to be snug. Like that. Alright, so now our chime has been fully reassembled. I'm going to go ahead and mount it on the testing jig, hang some tubes on it, and let's see what she sounds like. So here's our K44 Majestic Chime Base. It's mounted on our testing jig, and I've got my set of actual genuine NuTone K-model brass tubes hung on it. To show you the light, so I replaced the broken switch that was over here. On a Majestic chime, the switch, there's a little cutout or a little hole in the cover which mounts on the two posts right here and wraps around this, and it gives you an access to the rotary switch. And if we turn it on, there's our light right here, and that's fine. And let's go ahead and ring it. You'll notice that when it strikes, the light will dim a little bit. That's because on the shop bench power supply, it draws a little more current. The bench power supply has a little bit of a hard time keeping up with it. I do have coming up, I'm going to build a dedicated 20-volt transformer for the K-model chime testing, but it probably will always do that somewhat because the solenoids draw a fair amount of current, and you would see that in the light bulb. And actually, if you leave the light off, one of the things to consider is the light is burning a little bit of power from the transformer all the time when it's turned on. So when you're using a little bit, it's not much, but it's a little bit, but it also draws some current away from the solenoids. So actually, it will strike a little bit harder with the light turned off. So you have the option to do that. So that's our front door ring. Here's our rear door, which is just a single tube here. One of the things that's interesting is on the K-model chime bases with the revolving contact disc, I've noticed that you cannot use a button with a light in it for the front door button. And actually, you'll see here the light is, there is no light in this button because I actually have to take the little bulb out of the button. If you remember when I was showing and explaining how the revolving contact disc works in conjunction with the run and stop switch, as the disc rotates around and the cutout in the disc passes the run contact of the switch and then stops at the curvy contact number 2, and there's that paper thin gap between the edge of the contact disc and contact number 2 on the run stop switch. To make it function correctly, the disc has to stop in exactly the right spot with that little gap to break the connection between the two contacts of the switch. When you have a light bulb in the button, there's a little bit of current that flows through the bulb all the time, which is why this one's lit up. And that little bit of extra current makes the motor run just for a 1/10 of a second longer than without a button. And most of the time, the problem that seems to create is the disc doesn't stop in the right position, and that paper thin gap between the cutout in the disc and contact number 2 gets closed up, makes the connection, and the chime rings over and over and over endlessly. So apparently you cannot have a button with a light in it when you have this later version of a K-model chime, and I don't really see any way around that. It's inherent in the design. I'm going to look into what kind of button, I've never seen anything that there was a prohibition on buttons with lights, and I know that NuTone made buttons with lights in those days. So I don't know what the deal is with that exactly, but it just seems that that's the case. So you learn something new all the time. Let's go ahead and ring it one last time. And that's pretty good. The last thing I'm going to do to this, now that we know it functions correctly, is I've noticed in the testing of the chime that, remember we talked about when we put the brass caps on the ends of the Solenoids tubes, there are 2 of the 4 here on the front of the tubes where they seem to be a little bit loose, and the hammering of the plungers tends to push them out a little bit. So I'm going to push them back and reseat them, and then put the little drop of super glue to help hold them in place so that doesn't happen when the customer gets it back. And this one's ready to go. So I know this is a really, really long video. I have a feeling that it's going to be about 2.5 hours altogether. So in the description down below, I'm going to divide it up into different time segments for each step that we did. So if you don't want to watch the whole thing, you don't have to. If you sat through all of this, you probably know way more about mid-50s K model chime bases than you ever thought you would ever want to know. I hope you found this video to be interesting and perhaps helpful. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up on YouTube. Thumbs up help a lot, and we appreciate it. If you're interested in our videos and you learn things from them, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. If you subscribe, you'll get email notifications whenever we post a new video. That's all for today. See you on the next video.